If I was to ask you for a game that single-handedly built the first-person shooter as a genre, I would hope that you would return to me in unanimous agreement: Doom. The game was so popular they called other stuff like it Doom clones for a hot minute. Sure would be a shame if we made that mistake again. But if we were to talk about a game that established the genre on consoles, we would all say in unison, GoldenEye, goddammit. But after that failed introduction, you'd be hard set to not have Halo waving in your peripheral, desperately trying to get your attention. The PC shooters that reigned supreme, like Doom, Quake, and Blood, might have dominated their respective platform, but would fail to capture the masses for those that adopted controllers instead of keyboards, if they even got there in the first place. Instead, for many years, Halo stood tall, and while the modern military shooter would eventually leave Halo's relevance tossed to the wayside in pursuit of faster, more jam-smeared endeavours, it shouldn't bring down the enormous impact that the series had on the medium's history. Halo 1 revolutionized the single-player campaign. Gargantuan, varied landscapes, incredibly well-designed AI, with a story and characters that...
This cave is not a natural formation. Someone built it.
Well, they certainly put nursery rhymes on the nuance pedestal, but at least the world was infinitely more interesting than most first-person shooters of the time. To go along with that came an expansive multiplayer mode, and though many people remember and sing the praises of the multiplayer, it's important to remember that sometimes people are wrong. A rudimentary understanding of what made Halo fun led to maps and weapons that ended up creating a mode that aged with all the grace of Halo 3 machinima, but it's not like you can blame the devs for that. Halo's large-scale battles that allowed 16 players to play Blood Gulch was only properly functional 5 weeks prior to launch. With the uncertainty of its functionality, it could have never been high on the priority list. All of that would attempt to change though with Halo 2. Bigger, better, and infinitely more complicated. What we got was an incredible product, and while the single player was certainly a step up, the portion that saw not a mountain but a space elevator's worth of improvements was the multiplayer. The weapons were more interesting, you could actually tell what was happening, and the maps still ate ass. Except for Sanctuary, which is actually godlike. All around, the entire gameplay experience had been refined and expanded far beyond what the original laid down only 3 years prior, going so far as to rebuild its engine in order to accommodate for the new ideas in both the single and the multiplayer. However, as you might expect, this wasn't exactly an easy task. Halo 2's development is well documented as being a hellish experience. Day after day after day, 7 days a week, getting in reasonably early and then not leaving before 11 at night, 7 days a week for months and months. Isn't a quote that should come out of anyone in the industry, which unfortunately isn't something that seems to have changed much since Halo 2's development. What's worse is that once it finally released, many of the developers looked back on it as an underwhelming project, with many of its ideas not fully realized, and perhaps in retrospect that's how the core audience sees it as well. Talk to any Halo heads and they'll likely reminisce about the nostalgia of the original single player, leaving them in awe, or the experiences they had on Halo 3 Big Team Battle or custom games. Halo 2 almost always gets left to the wayside, and I certainly get why, but I still think that it's quite a shame. Especially as Halo 2 has one of the most bizarre, unusual pieces of tech that I've ever seen in a first-person shooter. Alongside the long list of unrealized features was likely an even longer list of known shippables, one of them being button combos. Now, when I say combo, don't start envisioning one of these, or God forbid the alphabet soup your friend who likes them anime games keeps talking about, but you're not super far off. After all, they are all ways of increasing the amount of damage that you do within a given time frame, just in a way that doesn't physically take away control from the opponent. Instead, we're talking about a collection of inputs to create unintended sequences. If you've played Halo, you know how the melee works, right? You do a little lunge punch, and then you gotta twiddle with your dick before you're allowed to do anything again. I know how this works. Wrong! Because reloading is very clearly a non-functional mechanic. Couldn't you tell? Just look at it! The three major button combos that we'll be talking about, the BXB, the BXR, and the Double Shot, all work thanks to their shared X's, which are their reloads. And before we go any further, we should probably quell the alphabet soup anxiety that's building up inside of not only you, but mostly me. The reason that these are called button combos, or button glitches, in the first place is because of the inputs that the actions correspond to on an Xbox gamepad. The important thing to understand is that it's not the buttons that make these combos work, it's the actions that follow them. Take the BXB and the BXR. Look them up on the command list and they might look like they function the same with a different ending input, but they do have a very important distinction. While both are melee cancels using reload to return someone to Flatfuck Friday in one sequence, one is slow and can be done at any time, and the other is fast but can only be done with a full clip. The BXB uses reload in boring, almost intentional ways, by simply taking the cancel properties that apply to both actions and looping them. BXRing isn't afraid to potentially get you banned though, we'll get onto that, by using reloading on a full clip to cancel your state and return you to neutral. It might not look like it, but after the melee and then unsuccessful reload, you're counted as having your gun out as normal so you can take a shot despite meleeing. My assumption is that calling for a reload at any point causes you to reset whatever action you're currently in, and only after is there a check to see if you're able to reload. So here you're not actually cancelling with a reload, you're cancelling with oddly implemented programming, so if you want to, you can go ahead and write professional hacker on your CV. After a melee, it only takes a single well-placed headshot to kill someone, and since the bullets come out on frame 1, BXRing is the better of the two choices on paper, but the actions that you'd need to take to get to that point with a full clip might make BXBing the better approach to a fight in the long run. This adds a layer of complexity to a simple melee system by providing you with a toss-up of weaker and stronger options that forces you to make choices mid-match to best suit your scenario. You also can't just look at the buttons and get the maneuver immediately. There's a timing to the hitbox that you'd probably never fully think about if you're not trying to manipulate it, that requires you to think about distance and timing when you're going for a cancel. Otherwise you'll end up cancelling early, with enough distance between you and your opponent to kiss them without doing any damage, or cancelling late and potentially wasting time. Now, is it good for the game? Let's leave that for a bit. Since the discussion gets a bit messy, which is why there's a third word in the title, let's instead move over to the much cooler Double Shot. If you've been paying attention, you might have a good guess on where double shots are going and how they're performed, by using the reload to cancel one shot into the next. Except that's not how that works, otherwise you'd be able to BXR at any point in your clip. It's to do with buffering in inputs, and in the process still using the reload wrong, but in new and completely unintuitive ways. If you've ever heard anyone talk about button combos and why they don't like them, they're probably talking about double shots more so than variations on melee. That's likely because for a small bug it can end up having some pretty heavy ramifications when it applies to the starting gun. The battle rifle is the defining weapon of Halo 2 multiplayer, being a 3-burst cooldown weapon. Think the Hemlock for all of you Apex Zoomers. Since you can't buffer in BR shots to get the perfect timing after a cooldown, knowing when you're allowed to embrace your inner American again can go a long way. In a game where 4 BR shots can end a man's life, but then 4 shots share pace with drying paint, being able to decrease the amount of time that it takes to get all of them shots out can be pretty damn important. So it's not really a surprise that some people, myself included, fixate on the double shot. The technique isn't entirely as the name implies. You're not shooting 2 shots at once, you're instead lining 2 different bursts back to back. In order to do this, you will need to have identified that I was actually lying about 3 sentences back, because there actually is a buffer window. It's just about as fickle as this post complaining about Halo Infinite development, not realizing that games have changed quite a fucking lot in the time between Halo 1 and 3, so you can't really make the same fucking argument. If you have a shot buffered in and reload while the shot is buffered, the bullet fires immediately after, regardless of cooldown. This technique might sound simple, and for some people it might be, but in order to learn how to do this, I have lost hours, maybe days, to sitting in lockout, walking around trying to get the timing to the point where I could rebuild this map polygon by polygon. I close my eyes and see only snow. The timing can be especially finicky to learn since firing is tied to a trigger. If you don't have the most dexterous fingers, you're gonna have to learn where the actuation point is on an analog input alongside a buffer timing with no feedback. I rebinded fire to a bumper. I am not trying to fire half a shot. Thank you very much, Steam. This forced shot also causes another glitch called the reload glitch, where you can no longer fire and you're actually reloading despite not being able to see it. So even though you have an objectively better fire rate than your opponent with a double shot, you add a nice little bit of risk versus reward since you're locked into a reload if you do it correctly. Except you're not. Because if you press Y twice quickly enough, you switch back into your gun, cancelling the reload and allowing you to shoot again. If you do another double shot immediately after that, we call it a quad shot. This certainly isn't the most flashy tech, it's not as dramatic as Demo Night Trimping, but do you remember the important number of shots that it takes to kill someone? Do you see some of the potential problems of allowing some players to double the speed at which they kill somebody and how that might divide the player base? And divide the player base it certainly did. For as much as gamers say they don't want politics in their video games, they sure are quick to pick sides. And in this bizarre comparison, I am a political centrist, sitting firmly in the middle of the road waiting to be splattered with middle school wisdom so I may be the paragon of the obvious, allowing me to point out that double shotting increases the skill ceiling, and maybe Obama did bad things too. Oh. That is to say, while a lot of people either land in the good or bad camp, both sides have genuinely valid arguments for their case, and it's more a matter of perspective and what you want out of the game. Hell, even Bungie chimed in on this. By the letter of the law, button glitches are cheating, says Tom Gioconda. Tom wanted 12-year-old you to get banned because you saw Halo 2 tricks for epic trolling in 144p, and based on the fact that they've never intentionally made their way back into a game, gives me a decent assumption that the rest of the devs weren't so keen on it either. But I mean, 343 now own Halo, and you can't get banned for double shotting an MCC, so go fucking wild. From the perspective of casual players, button combos became a barrier between them and their fun game about driving funny warthog and shooting Green Man. From the competitive players, button combos became another way to differentiate yourself from other players and expand player expression. But when you've got these two conflicting ideas, it's also important to identify how something is expanding the skill ceiling. If we look at something like rocket jumping, it sure as hell increases the skill ceiling. It allows you to move faster and be more mobile. This might allow you to have more flexible routes around the map to control item spawns in Quake, or give you the opportunity to make more risky picks in something like TF2. What makes it so good is that the tech increases the skill ceiling by allowing players new opportunities, leaving the players that can't do the tech with a more limited pool of choices to make, but ones that are still viable and engaging. Rocket jumping doesn't change your ability to do a task, it changes the amount of approaches that you have to a task. On top of that, it's an option that makes logical sense. Rockets cause objects to change their trajectory. I am an object, therefore I can use this rocket to change my trajectory. Middle school wisdom at its finest. Combine the tech with some well-designed hitboxes and it makes for a skill that doesn't take a long time to learn, but can be a skill to practice and get better at, both in the action of performing it and also how it is applied. You know, very similarly, double shotting allows you to shoot at double the speed of your opponent because the game's programmed with good. Double shotting and the rest of the button combos don't really allow you new approaches to a task, it just allows you to do the same thing but better. Maybe not in the conventional sense of fighting a million Kirin to make the number go bigger, but my 4 shots from the starting weapon shoot faster than yours isn't really expansive to scenarios in the way that many people are looking for. A lot of the core appeal of Halo was how different equipment would change how you approach a scenario, and while people liked the idea of being good, they wanted to do that in ways that was being more creative with the tools that they're given, not practicing muscle memory. That's not to say that double shotting and other tech that's just harder execution for more reward can't be fun. Traditional fighters have been slow as hell to budge on that one and find new ways of being entertaining. If you wanted to take the concept of these exploits and employ it into a comfortable mechanic to work with, you could create some real fun around creating weapons that reward precise timing, and potentially create another way of testing out the player's dexterity that isn't just how precise they can be with the headshots. Even inside of this environment where I think it clashes against a lot of Halo's appeal, to the point where I'd probably consider it a detriment to most people's experience, I'd be lying if I said it didn't elicit a giggle or two out of me the first couple of times that I used it effectively, but I'm also the guy that's eaten the alphabet soup by the dozen. So long as I enjoy the scenario enough, I'll want to master it. However, even as someone that's willing to put in the time to learn this input, it still feels uncomfortable and it's clunky and it's technically consistent, but it sure as fuck doesn't feel like it in a franchise where most of the appeal for an extremely large part of the player base is the way that power weapons, the maps, and the vehicles feed into a game full of unexpected moments. Most of the time, I want to hop into a game where me and the boys go, holy shit, that was so cool, I didn't know you could do that. Not, bro, that's not even impressive. Ninja 1 and Ninja 2 have been doing that since 2007. And then they call you whatever word they pull out of their 6-letter vocabulary hat that somehow always ends up being a slur. BXRing is fun to me from a higher level perspective, and I'd argue that if you're going into a game from 2004 for a competitive experience, then the small layers that it adds to engagements are great, even if they make for scenarios that are to be honed rather than innovated upon. But that doesn't mean that it's a skill that most players would want to get better at. It's not a problem that the other person wants to get better, but sometimes exploits like button combos make them better in a way that negatively impacts someone else's experience. Dedicated players who want to use the game to prove themselves might be fine with button combos that require you to learn unintuitive rhythms, since it allows them to get a leg up on people that don't want to put that time in, and makes them fights where both players can perform the maneuver even more exciting. But the people who are trying to enjoy the game for the unique scenarios that it can throw you in don't want to feel like they're down a peg just because they didn't want to do something that isn't fun to learn. These combos aren't intrinsically flawed just because they're hard and unconventional, and they're not inherently good just because it increases the skill ceiling. The reason that they ended up being so controversial is because it was placed inside of a game that was introducing a concept to a massive audience with largely conflicting ideas on what Halo was to them. With Halo's development leaning more and more towards its sandbox rather than its competitive elements, which I think it should do, I think it's pretty hard to argue that button combos had a real place in Halo as a franchise. However, for Halo 2 as a standalone title, I think it might have actually had a positive effect. While it might have ended up dividing the player base, it assisted in giving Halo 2 a more defined niche within the audience. The players that are still around are those that are quite competitive by nature, certainly not in the ways that are good, mind you, but these combos might leave the player base here satisfied with something that the other games haven't provided. Halo 2 had many problems. Hit scan BR, 4 grenade slots, the fact that people think midship is good, Team Slayer still being the most popular game type, the fact that sword comes out almost instantly, plasma pistol not draining on charge, the general audio design, the guns are too large, fucking hell, what is this, one of my reviews? But whether or not you see the fleeting button combos as one of them, all comes down to taste. Love them or hate them, they will remain a part of Halo 2's history, and in my opinion, it still tastes pretty good. Something sword flying, I couldn't find a way to work it into the video and it's only in single player, I'm not sorry.